Hello and welcome to another episode of About the Clouds. I'm your host, Daniel Humphreys from Lawrence Harvey. And today we have a little twist in store for you. It's our first in-person episode. We are very lucky to be invited to the head offices at PwC UK here at Embankment Place. So this is the show where we delve into the fascinating future of cloud technology. I'm joined by Bonnie Adams, Women in Cloud leader at PwC and Director of Cloud Transformation for Financial Services, and her esteemed colleague, Rob McCargow, Technology Impact Leader and one of the drivers of AI at PwC here. So, welcome, guys. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
Great to have you both on the show. For our listeners at home, would you mind kicking us off with a bit of a background about yourself?
Okay, so my name's Bonnie Adams. I'm a Financial Services Cloud Transformation Director within PwC, obviously in the UK firm. I lead on large-scale transformations, primarily within the banking sector, but we also obviously touch insurance and other types of financial services organisations. Within the context of the broader organisation, I work really closely with Rob within our Cloud Centre of Excellence function that we've just stood up in the last sort of year to 18 months. And as you can imagine, we are incredibly busy at the moment helping our clients with that transformation journey that they need to go on. Prior to this, I worked client side, so I was on the banking side, and I've probably been in this industry now for about 26 plus years, which is kind of a little bit scary, and me kind of sharing my age when I probably shouldn't.
True.
But yes, I work really closely with Rob on all things cloud, and obviously Rob takes care of the AI side of things, hence he's tag teaming with me today.
Fantastic.
So I'm going to hand on to Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for coming in, and great to have this conversation today. So I've been with the firm about 8 years, heavily involved in driving a lot of our artificial intelligence work, and clearly that's become quite a big deal recently.
Oh, no, I haven't really heard of it.
No. Maybe we could elaborate further over the course of the next half hour. But so really the interesting opportunity now is how clients of ours are on this journey to the cloud. The impact in particular of recent developments and things like generative AI have really brought this to the fore, but it's quite clear that many organizations still have a long way to go to get there in terms of cloud infrastructure, data strategy, and getting the core ingredients in place. So a lot of my work is driving our market activation around cloud, and in particular AI on top of that as well. Fascinating area. And for me, not really coming from a traditional background in technology, it's been a great journey looking at the broader impact on things like the workforce, on the ethical considerations of technology, and the bigger picture around regulation and how this will evolve and impact the very essence of business models and society at large.
Yeah, fantastic. I know this is above the cloud, so I'm trying to make this as cloud technology relevant as possible, but of course AI is a huge thing in the industry right now, and they're obviously very closely related spaces. Is this something that took you by surprise a little bit, you think, this movement into AI, or were you expecting it, how's it come about?
I mean, from my side of things, it's been, I'd say, a relatively niche topic for the best part of 5 to 10 years now. I often felt I was there to do the party trick at the end of an event, bring some futurism to the occasion, but it felt like a lot of organizations were nowhere near actually starting to make good on the opportunity by it. What we've seen with the advent of the scaling growth in data, in cloud capability, and now with the democratization and usability of these technologies is an absolute tidal wave of growth around this now, and every 10 minutes having another incoming conversation on this, aren't we, at the moment?
Yeah.
The thing that surprised me actually is actually where the interest is coming from. So this now is cutting across all parts of business, isn't it? We're talking as much with HR directors one day, the boards of directors, business schools and beyond. So you're finding actually that the interest is coming from all quarters of business and society at large.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, the whole cloud conversation is essentially an enabler to the speed at which that thing is now taken off. If you look at the ways in which you would leverage AI capabilities, there is an element of making sure that you've got the right underlying infrastructure and hosting in place to enable it. And so what the cloud has done in some cases is accelerate that and enable it to happen. Organisations that would have naturally been barrier to that sort of innovation are now able to leverage marketplace services from the CSPs or cloud service providers and essentially put in place things that maybe sort of even 2-3 years ago would have been harder for them to achieve. So my feeling is, whilst yes, this is above the clouds, actually it is really pertinent towards this and other innovation activities that we can certainly see coming down the line.
It's almost like a natural stepping stone from cloud technology, right? And you know we may have seen that drive and that increase in speed to this revolution in AI caused by maybe even the start of the pandemic, when that cloud infrastructure wasn't really in place the same way it was till after the pandemic, and everyone had to go to cloud, and then we saw that massive acceleration of even 3-5 years advancing cloud technology, and that speed has almost carried us through. And that momentum has now got us into that place where generative AI is now we're able to do it. Do you think that the pandemic had an impact in the same way that I'm saying?
It's had a very interesting impact on innovation more broadly. The way we work, where we work, and all of that, I think, has fed into a need. But I think also you're realising that a lot of this innovation was driven by necessity for basic survival at a corporate level. We're speaking to many of our customers over the last few years who had certain technology investments years down on their roadmap, but having to bring them into a matter of months and succeeding in that endeavour. So that pace of innovation has accelerated quite substantially in the last 2 or 3 years, in my experience.
Yeah, and I'd say actually there are other trigger events that are still pertinent today, even, without COVID in the mix, that are in effect forcing us to change, as you say, maybe the investment profile or the strategic direction of an organisation because of need and commercial viability, i.e. if they don't transform, there are others that are transforming faster, and as a consequence, they maybe won't exist in 12 to 18 months' time. So certainly the conversations that I'm seeing, not just within financial services, but more broadly, are relative very much to the macro environment that we currently find ourselves in, and how that is now causing or triggering certain decisions to come in a lot earlier.
Yeah. So PwC recently announced a significant investment into generative AI with, what was it, $1 billion? That's a global investment, right? So, how can you share some insights into how PwC might be looking to use that investment, and affect the various industries, not just technology, but broader as well?
I think there's a number of components to the way that you go about investing in this, as evidenced by this fairly substantial investment we're taking. I think one of the key things we've got to work on is the way we enable the workforce internally. So there's a huge amount of investment that goes into that. We've stood up a working group of over 6,000 colleagues around the world to effectively work out how to ideate and innovate around this technology. The key part as well, in addition to that, is the way we work with our alliance partners, in this case Microsoft, to scale the opportunity and enterprise. And a key part of that also is into the models we're now going to work directly with OpenAI on with that investment. Excellent. So a number of different components to that comes into the equation. The interesting bit here, though, is around back to the innovation point. Where does the innovation come from? How do you triage those use cases? How do you avoid too much of a centralised mindset to this? So one of the things we've tried to get right first is making sure we've got the culture right across the organisation, because we know the best innovation comes from those different parts of the business. But how do we avoid too much duplication of effort? How do we really focus on the areas of the greatest value? And critically, I'm sure we'll get into this as well, Dan, is those issues around risk as well. Because we're now moving into use cases of quite substantial regulatory consequence, significant enterprise considerations around data privacy and protection and other issues. And there's very, very key issues around things like reputational risk as well. So how do you move the dial on this to drive enterprise value in a sustainable way, but in a way that builds trust with your stakeholders and your regulators and your workforce and your customers, but allows you to move at pace to keep that pace of innovation happening as well, so you're not left behind. So there's quite a lot going into that, which is around innovation models, as well as putting the guardrails in place to do this really effectively.
That's such a on-point topic at the moment. The UK is positioning itself quite well, I feel, to take advantage of that. Be that sort of Goldilocks between what it could be quite a draconian EU almost, in their position, and a bit more gun-ho US. So, it looks like Rishi and the team in the government are sort of positioning us quite well to be a leader in that position. So, very interesting space to be talking about at the moment. But I think what we'll do now is we'll go on to the main segment of the show. This is essentially above the clouds. So we'll be talking about some buzzwords, some that have already potentially come up already. And we'll be looking at those buzzwords and taking a stance on whether they are truly innovative and scoring them out of 10. So 10 being, i.e., above the clouds, 5 in the clouds, it's cloud technology, but it's nothing innovative, and then 0 out of 10, ground level, potentially BS, load of waffle. Yeah. So let's see where we go. So we have our lovely square cloud-shaped box here with some things. So we'll start off with this one. So regulation, right? Okay, very innovative, almost almost ironic, But regulation obviously is a big key aspect of cloud and AI at the moment. What sort of thoughts do you have on regulation as a buzzword in the industry?
So I think I agree with you. It's not necessarily a buzzword in the innovation sense, but it is certainly a driver to the requirements that the organisations leveraging both AI and cloud will need to kind of be mindful of. Mm-hmm. So if you think within the context of financial services organisations, they will have, usual GDPR regs and other things they need to consider, but then they're also facing into, regulator conditions and concerns around things like operational resilience. Mm-hmm. So how do you maintain service availability when services go down on the cloud, right? And what's become quite interesting over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, I worked with the European banks on how to look at operational resilience as a topic, for example, and how does that then get played out in innovation, i.e., what is the response from the cloud service providers to help support operational resilience requirements that are set by the regulator, whether that's in the EU or in the UK post-Brexit? So in terms of the innovations that we're seeing more access to things like serverless, where you've got the ability to be able to consume services in any of the CSPs. We're still quite a way away from it. You will see multi-cloud products on the market, etc. The issue isn't necessarily with the products themselves. So, a SaaS provider deploying across all 3 clouds, great. It's the peripheral services that sit around the edges that need to be set up in order to make it an enterprise grade level service. And actually, those services aren't necessarily easy to move between in the event of an incident or failure. So at the moment, I'm expecting, and I am starting to see this already, a raft of kind of changes and amalgamations occurring across all 3 clouds where they start to kind of align on certain conditions and services, because the way in which the services are configured and consumed in each cloud can be incredibly different. And so being able to stand up sort of 2 or 3 clouds in order to support an operational resilience answer actually at this point is really hard to achieve, incredibly expensive, and causes issues around actually when you try doing this under kind of duress, under incident, what is it possible? Could you even prove it out? As I say, that's where I'm kind of seeing some of that innovation coming down the line. On the other side, if you're looking at the more kind of global banks, they're facing into things where, you can't host data for certain countries outside the country's jurisdiction. So those regulations prevent you from being able to set up a resilient position if there is only one set of kind of regions within that country. So what's the answer for that? And if they're being asked to be resilient, how do they kind of achieve that when it's only in one country? Because that's where the data needs to be for another regulatory condition. So at the minute, you've got these kind of competing regulations coming out that when you try and architect for them or architect around them, it's incredibly hard to do. And so, as I say, I can see that innovation pipeline coming down, almost looking at the opportunity that then creates and trying to solve it through tech rather than trying to solve it through process. So that's the kind of innovation I'm seeing from regulation.
Yeah, lovely. How do you see the intersection of cloud technology and regulation, either enabling or hindering things like AI and generative AI in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting myth to bust is that regulation has to act as a hard barrier to innovation. I think this is often cited, isn't it? And clearly bad regulation can hinder innovation, but there's plenty of examples where good regulation drives and accelerates it.
Yeah.
And it's much more than just the hard regulation environment itself. There's so many other considerations here, from the standards as well, which I think is something that's more agile to stand up. And when you start getting into some of the things that are directly accountable to your value as an organisation, your purpose, and your broader ESG credentials, you're thinking about things like ethical frameworks. Then there's a lot of noise in there about what good technology looks like, tech for good, responsible use of tech. And in reality, there's very little that's done to operationalise that in practice. So you've seen this glut of ethical principles published in the last 4 or 5 years that talk about things like our technology should be transparent and fair and equitable and accountable and interpretable. But when you look to then implement that in a really hard use case in a bank body, you haven't got those necessary guardrails in place. So a lot of the work we've done is to try to put this structure in place of how to bring that to life. So I think I'm trying to sort of expand out further from purely the regulatory environment we're talking about here. And yes, as you speak to, there's clear differences geopolitically between China, the US, the EU, and where the UK sits in amongst that. So you're right, I think Goldilocks is the right approach, but don't think about this purely as a regulatory conversation. Think about the broader considerations increasingly when it comes to things like trustworthiness as an organisation.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Definitely, regulation is good, and in some ways, and I think inherently, I like naturally, I'm quite anti-regulation as a person. But there's two things that I'd say. There probably needs to be some regulation. It'd be like nuclear weapons and AI. We've all seen Terminator. We don't want it to go too far down the wrong road. Okay, great. So, in terms of looking at regulation from a cloud perspective, we don't, again, want to focus on cloud. Obviously, that's been something that we've been looking at for a few years now. Do you still feel like there's a way to go with cloud technology and the regulation around it?
I do. We're definitely seeing stuff in terms of regulation going through the House of Lords and other kind of committees that opine on that stuff. There are some open questions around whether or not the cloud service providers need to be regulated in the same way that the banks do. Mm-hmm. So critical service providers within the market, i.e. detrimental to the UK economy type stuff, they do need to attest to certain things. And so the open question out there is, well, hold on, if we've got some of the most substantial UK banks and broader now sitting on these services, do they themselves need to kind of attest to, as I say, DR standards, whatever security, who has access to the data, all of that sort of stuff. And so actually what you might find is that because of the way the banks are having to respond, that becomes a bit of a catalyst to other decisions being made, like regulating the CSPs themselves. Now, how you do that worldwide, I do not know. I can only explore what it means right now for the UK and how those regulations might inform. On the other side, I can also see question marks over things like ESG, because actually you could argue a more efficient setup, more efficient consumption of those services, and not running so many data centers in the UK would be a positive impact on the environment, for example. And actually the banks themselves are having to attest to certain things within the ESG frameworks. So there is a bit of me that goes, actually, I'm seeing, the regulation kind of being a catalyst, mm-hmm. but also the cloud service providers themselves needing to think about what that means for them, mm-hmm. their businesses, and how the regulation will need to be adopted in the future as more and more organisations start consuming those services.
Do you with especially with financial services, and especially in the UK, having such a bustling financial sector, mm-hmm. Do you see the UK as a leader in cloud regulation as like it is, positioning itself with AI? Yeah,
it definitely is. It definitely is. It's the it itself obviously has the conditions that were previously there from when we were part of the EU. Mm-hmm. There is a small divergence occurring in certain spaces, but actually, broadly speaking, we're aligned in what the EU is doing. I do think we can as an organisation, along with our clients and customers, etc., work through how we can accelerate certain things. So if we're pushing on doors within the cloud service providers to stand up services that enable that portability at speed, and I mix the two words on purpose here. So at one end, you've got kind of resilience. So demonstrate to me that your services are, fault tolerant in the event of failure. At the other end, though, is I need to be able to exit those services within X number of weeks, months, because, the events that I get called out for are things like, Google or Microsoft becomes a bank, and that plus the existing infrastructure and services that are sitting on there is just too much. It's a concentration risk. So in the event that you either, wanted to exit the provider and the trigger event was, something like that, or actually you just want to move your services because you don't want to be kind of tied in so much, there is an element of making sure that you're set up to do that. And at the minute, that's where I'm seeing the innovation coming in, i.e. you could go multi-cloud across 3 clouds, but as I said before, in reality, it's going to cost you a huge amount to do. You then ask in the question, what are you actually solving for?
Yeah.
Is it resilience or portability? And then if you start consuming the sort of non-platform as a service offerings and you go more IaaS, you are in effect locking yourself into the services you're consuming at that level. So I'm kind of like, what problem are you actually solving? There's always going to be a pendulum between portability versus resilience. Yeah. And you can be resilient in a single CSP. So then the question is, what are you solving for? And usually I get, I have to be able to demonstrate that I'm not locked into a vendor. Which, when you play that through, it's either hybrid cloud, as we'll get to, or it is, I have to have 2 clouds and I can flip between both. That is a really hard thing to do right now. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm seeing regulation.
Cool. So, scores on the doors, regulation, cloud technology regulation, AI regulation. How innovative are we feeling it? How relevant is and how above the clouds are we?
It's a strong 10 for me, I think.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah.
It is, because it's the catalyst. Yeah. The word regulation on its own, no. But actually what it then drives in terms of behaviour and response, whether it's us as a professional services firm, our clients, or the CSPs, it can be an enabler for it rather than being seen as a boundary to entry.
Excellent. Well, that surprised me, I have to admit. Moving on to our second subject now, if our listeners haven't figured out at home, it is hybrid cloud. So we had Tim Busfield on the last episode who talked about multi-cloud. So maybe to start off with, what's the main difference between multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, and what are the benefits and cons potentially of the difference?
So my version of this is that I actually stopped using cloud in conversations. And I know that sounds really weird, but it's a bit of an oxymoron because it's just a pattern of hosting, right? So what you're actually talking about is, where are you hosting your services and why?
Yeah.
And so what hybrid cloud is trying to solve is a bit towards the regulation piece. And actually, it could be towards things like data sovereignty, where your data resides in terms of it cannot sit outside the 4 walls of your building. So actually what we're seeing within regards to hybrid cloud is normally a response answer to a resilience question or a response answer to vendor lock-in. So services like Anthos on Google and others on the other CSPs are essentially enable some services to be able to be deployed within your own data centre, or a third party's data centre that's not yours if you're consuming third party services. But you've got to ask yourself the question, why do you need it?
Yeah.
And usually it's in response to regulation or resilience or some other pattern requirement. And so hybrid cloud is essentially your ability to consume both what's on public cloud and essentially what's in your own data center or private cloud or another, like there are lots of other, cloud choices, Salesforce, Oracle Cloud at Customer, all of those are in the mix as well. And so the services in the innovation space that you're seeing coming out are trying to solve for that. Yeah, so being able to deploy Kubernetes clusters in both, AWS and your own DC, for example. Well, why would you need that? And that again goes back to, what are the requirements driving you for that sort of pattern versus another? So slightly different, because multi-cloud obviously is 2 public clouds. Hybrid is obviously public and, another that may not be public.
Awesome. So, with hybrid cloud, outside of that financial services or regulated industry like healthcare or something like that, what are the benefits for other industries that might not necessarily need it, because they're told they need it? Do you have any examples of where there are some benefits to it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a psychology to deploying services in your own data center. I think if you're naturally nervous or you've got a risk-adverse organisation, so say you work in health, and the healthcare services have got obviously access to incredibly sensitive personal information, you might decide that the organisation's maturity and your current view of the risk position is that actually you don't feel comfortable deploying it externally on public cloud because you don't necessarily trust that you've stood the services up in a secure way that couldn't be leveraged externally. And so what you might then do is test and learn internally with your engineers, kind of get them a certificate of goodness, basically to prove that they've got that maturity and understanding. And in those sorts of cases, doing it within, we call it your castle and moat, essentially, within your own castle means that you can be a little bit more, prescriptive with what the security protocols and concerns look like, and you can make it non-internet facing, but you're still getting access to certain marketplace services that allow you to innovate in a safe way internally. At a point in time when you've kind of proven maturity and you've kind of gone up that maturity curve a little bit more, you might then go, well, actually, now we're going to kind of test it with stuff that's a little bit less sensitive, but allows us to kind of do it in a very controlled way. So I have seen it in the healthcare, I've seen it in government. And so within the context of that, having a hybrid cloud environment that still allows you to innovate and consume those new services, but does so in a way that kind of enables the organisation to transform internally as well.
So Rob, something that could really enable, the development of AI, having that safe space to experiment and break stuff and risk it all, but, have the power there to actually to use the technology at the same time.
I totally agree, yeah. And I think both at a sort of internal level, there's opportunity in those safe spaces to sort of push the boundaries where you can before you put them into production. There are specific issues around scaling out into production, we've seen for quite some time, and that gets back to the guardrails piece as well. But also back to the regulatory piece as well, there's now a lot of work happening across all the key regulators in the UK to look at a kind of a combined regulatory sandboxes as well. So back to this point around regulation driving innovation, there's definitely that appetite to do that rather than be a roadblock there. But this is quite an iterative innovation process, isn't it, Bonnie? It's not something where you can necessarily set out your stall with a traditional technology investment and see this particular outcome in 12 to 24 months' time. There's going to be a lot of test and learn and fail that you have to sort of build in. And many organisations, in particular, quite regulated ones, haven't traditionally been that comfortable with that approach to acceptance and celebration of failure, if anything. It's back to this psychology piece. That isn't necessarily inbuilt into many organisations like that.
Fantastic. Well, how do you see sort of hybrid cloud progressing even further in a few years and enabling, technology like edge computing, IoT, that type of thing?
Yeah, exactly right. So you're going to see more and more of it. When the first iteration, so if you think the Anthos beta version, I'm sure it was something like August 21 at Next, was in my head. I may well be wrong, so apologies, Google. When we were exploring Anthos, a previous organisation, we were looking at the use cases under which we would kind of, use those services. And at the time, I think the database services weren't available, but they had obviously done Kubernetes, they'd done some of the virtual machine estate, etc. But I think the roadmap then was to kind of bring more and more kind of marketplace services into the mix. The other thing that you're talking to when you're talking about edge and the ability to deploy those things is the fact that you can also then see them, right? Because it comes with a bunch of kind of peripheral services, and AWS and Microsoft have similar. That means then that you're, again, going back to your risk position and your tolerance for risk, you can solve different problems. So you're going much further out into the network. You're less constrained by the network architecture as it is in, say, London, for example. So there are 2 co-locations on west and east of London. If you're going to start consuming points of presence out there, you kind of want to be able to see that stuff. And then the use cases that might drive you for consuming, say, a 5G or an edge case, it becomes more of an evolution. It sits on that innovation curve again. The only use cases that I've seen that have worked really well have been in the container space for now. That doesn't mean there aren't any more, and there definitely will be, sure. But it goes back to what problem are you solving? And I think as the banks are starting to look more and more at that kind of regulation piece, they will naturally be driven towards developing more and more services within the hybrid cloud and more use cases for where it should be. And I guess our jobs at PwC is to help them to understand within our alliance partners what sorts of use cases are we seeing across industry, and how could a development of a hybrid cloud kind of architecture help with solving that, and where we can partner up and create opportunity within that space.
I think what you just touched on there with the container Kubernetes pieces is something we were talking about with Ryan Kirk at Formula One, where he was saying that the developments in cloud technology was actually now being passed back to on-prem.
Correct.
And they're using a hybrid setup, and so that innovation with Kubernetes is now being used on-prem where it was not being used before. Do you see any other opportunities like that in the coming years?
Yeah, definitely do. So if you think about legacy organisations that are running old architectures, etc., a lot of them are configured in a way that is not necessarily suitable for cloud, right? So one of the migration patterns that you could adopt is a partial refactor of the application, but you need to kind of do something with the data or the other front-end hosted services. So you could do that internally first, and then you can use that as a migration pattern to move to the cloud, which de-risks is not a big jump. Rather than a massive jump of refactoring everything, you might find that the sequencing of the work means that you need to have, 4 or 5 other things to make that end-to-end customer journey work, right? If that's the case, then being able to reconfigure certain services into, say, Kubernetes or another using a hybrid cloud pattern would be a way to solve for that. But it doesn't mean that you're then taking the risk of, it's either or. You're doing both. And so then your pattern and your sequencing of how you get there changes. It de-risks it, and in some cases can speed you up because you start to consume the ecosystem and the services and the tool chain of the CSP in your own DC first. People get to learn how to use those services before you go to public cloud. And it's it's more hops, but it's less risky, and in some cases that makes more sense. Likewise, certain technical services need to consume services next door to each other, i.e. they've got latency requirements that mean you can't just move them because it's too far, and it needs to replicate synchronously, and I know I'm going technical, so apologies. But in those examples, actually having, partially refactored the service you want to move, but de-risking the migration pattern because you can do the other as well, means that you haven't got to worry about that as a requirement anymore, or it's less of an issue because it's part of your planning.
Fantastic. So, hybrid cloud, where are we ranking it in the clouds?
I think it's a 5 at the moment for me. It needs to evolve. It definitely needs to evolve, and I think the one prior to this could be a catalyst if thought about in the right way.
Yeah, it's a middle of the cloud, I think. I'd agree with that.
It's been around, it's still here, still got a way to go, more work to do.
Yeah, and people interchangeably mix up hybrid and multi all the time.
Well, you tell them, Bonnie. Cool, so third and final topic today, diversity and inclusion. Bonnie, especially one I'm sure that's close to your heart, but really cool topic. Bonnie, to you, as a women in cloud leader at PwC, what sort of strategies do you see that enable that diversity and inclusion and equal opportunities for women in cloud tech?
Yes, I've got some stats for you. So we've redone these recently, haven't we, Rob? Yeah. So I think it was sort of 27% of females in IT, but in cloud it's more like 14%. So when we did some analysis to look at what the root causes were of why we're seeing that kind of drop off. I mean, 26% isn't great anyway. Well, 14's even worse. The answer was multifaceted, as you would expect, but one of the things that we saw was actually people moving towards cloud as a technology space may have had traditionally infrastructure-based backgrounds. And so actually when you look at the demographic and gender of individuals in that space, that actually is not too far different to what we have today in cloud. She's just a natural evolution. So if I've done infrastructure all my life and tin and wire, moving over to kind of, a cloud-based version of the answer, it was an easier hop, I would argue. So that was kind of one reason. Another reason, which we are looking at PwC, so we're working with other third parties to explore this one, is the topic of IT in schools. So I didn't study IT at school, and the reason why is because it's incredibly dry. Right, as a topic, it wasn't particularly exciting, and it is done so in a way that lends itself more naturally to logical thinkers, of course, right? However, I find that IT can be used in an incredibly creative way, which fits beautifully with individuals who are more likely to be creative versus not. And so that's kind of another reason. So the education that goes into schools and actually the topics, when I've re-reviewed them at GCSE, still don't have a huge amount about cloud. They're still talking about binaries. Yeah. There's virtually nothing in there for AI, by the way. And so we're exploring what an evolution of training would look like if you was going to leave school at 16, maybe a T level, right, in the cloud, or AI. How awesome, right? I'd love to be able to sponsor something like that. And then when I think about the other things that I've personally done, and I talked about this actually at another event the other week, any CV that I receive, I ask HR to strip out the names, the genders, where they live. I don't want to know any of it.
Yeah.
I literally just want to know who you are, what are your interests, what have you done, and why this job. That's it. I don't care about anything else. And I know that may or may not sit right with people, but in my mind, I'm like, if there was any preconceived unconscious bias that I don't realise I have, I cannot apply it in this context. Even to the point of saying, I actually don't want to know how long they've been in a job. Because that in itself can be a barrier to kind of work.
Well, you're speaking my language as a tech recruiter. So, plain black, white CVs, I saw a CV the other day, which was an advert for an Amazon product, and a CV, it was ghastly. I had to send it back to him and say, please change this. But a bit like, just going on what you were saying about sort of that infrastructure to cloud, you're seeing that demographic transfer into cloud. Almost similar to that, but almost a counter to that, we're seeing the natural progression from cloud to AI.
Yes.
Do you think that progression into AI will, and the creativity opportunities around will foster, an increase in women joining the tech industry?
I can weigh in on that if you like, Bonnie. I mean, I think it's getting to the point where it has to. If you think about actually what the very definition of a technology role looks like these days, it's much more diverse in terms of the disciplinary skills that make it up. So if you're thinking about applying this to the AI function now, the only way you're going to get good technology that's debiased, that's equitable, that's serving the broadest part of your customer base is having a representative workforce. And I'm not talking here just about gender, albeit that is just as bad in AI as it is in cloud. But it's thinking about some of those other skills coming to the fore. And if you think about some of the specific characteristics of generative AI around the training data, around the governance you put in place, around the way the innovation comes from, this requires a really different approach to the makeup of who you're bringing into the sector. To give you an idea, one really high-profile project that we ran during lockdown was using biometric data on our staff, all manner of considerations from a privacy and ethics standpoint to get this right. And we had to be absolutely bulletproof with this. So the range of skills we had in there, the technologist came last. We had a medical doctor, we had a regulatory expert, we had a HR practitioner that's quite tech savvy. We've got a team now of technology ethicists in the team. We have, I know, easy for me to show my teeth in this morning, but a colleague of mine, Maria, leads out a lot of our work on ethics, which is now red hot. And then bring in the data science, bring in the machine learning capability at the back end to get those safeguards in place. So if it's been that around, that's a really exciting place to be, because similarly, I came from a science background. I didn't come in from technology at the start. And this is a really key way to drive diversity into the sector, and also thinking about social mobility, I think, which your approach to CVs is really important to take into account now as well. So I'm really excited about the diversification of the functional skills that make up a tech career now, because that means we're much more able to draw upon a greater pool of talent to take us forward.
Excellent. So, beyond gender diversity, there are obvious challenges around things like neurodiversity and other minorities in the industry. How can organisations like PwC, but also the government and the broader society help foster a more inclusive environment for these other groups within society?
Okay, so I probably have talked about this one before, and it's not a tick box exercise in any way, shape or form, but I come from a socially diverse background. Mum and Dad were working class, East London, if you haven't guessed by the accent, although it sounds very Essex now, so I don't understand that. And I was diagnosed with ADHD in February, which I think I've always known about, if I'm completely honest. Always felt a bit different. And I was saying the other week at another event, always felt like I was a bit too much in school, too much at home. So I get it. And obviously was a female in tech back in 1996. Barriers to entry, you would argue, were huge. But what I do know from my own personal experiences, each one of those characteristics that is part of who I am and part of my makeup has become a reason, i.e. in spite of. So I've gone ahead and pushed myself even when it felt incredibly comfortable. I've turned up client site even when I've been petrified and I'm shaking. Mm-hmm. Every single thing that I've been through has been a catalyst to the version of me as I am now. So I believe the more diverse the individuals that you bring in, the more resilient they are, because they've, had more knocks. They've probably got more internal narrative telling them they're not going to be good enough, potentially. And I'm paraphrasing here, but in terms of thinking and how that thinking helps organisations to transform, I genuinely believe the more diverse, the better, in my mind. And actually, what I've seen is when the going gets tough, they tend to be more resilient. They tend to bounce back quicker because they got used to it really early doors. And having to struggle, at a very young age and not really knowing until now how that has shaped me and who I am and how I got where I am today, I think it's a really important thing. And so I regularly share what I've been through and everything else and the path that it's taken me on. And I corrected myself again 2 weeks ago when I said, I'm really lucky. No, I'm not lucky. I worked really hard for this. Yeah, it wasn't luck. I pushed constantly, even when it felt uncomfortable. And so actually, would I take any of those things away? No.
The key now is, exactly. The key now is to make this, not just the exception that proves the rule, but to get in much earlier. So we spoke earlier about a lot of the issues we've realised from our research is, for example, girls have deselected themselves from the workforce, as well as neurodiverse kids. So one of the most inspiring things I saw this year was I took a group of our team down to a school event, about 800 kids in Tower Hamlet. Mm-hmm. And one of the groups that brought in were neurodiverse kids. And Chris from our team, he's from our digital accessibility team, just role modelling the fact that he's got a stellar career. Yeah. He's right at the peak of his powers. Was just it's really moving. Yeah. And I don't know about your school. I went to a comprehensive in Nottingham. We never had inspiring people come into school. We had no idea. So if you're without a view that a tech career is for you, and you're from a minority background or a diverse background, it's a real double whammy. So I'm a big believer in get in early, inspire, put those role models in place and show off and show what great careers are available now, because these are superpowers, aren't they?
They are.
It's not disabilities, yeah?
I think there's definitely a balance. Obviously there's some way to go in supporting people of all backgrounds to feel comfortable in a role itself. But beyond that, like you said yourself, Bonnie, be comfortable to speak up, and have that opportunity to promote yourself and promote the other people around you in that way. So definitely some way to go. But it's great to see examples like yourself doing so well. Diversity and inclusion, where are we rating it?
You get more than 10.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's
above
almost, you can't rate that, can you?
No, and if you think of the use case around Gen AI, right, having really diverse views enables kind of Gen AI to be way more balanced. I've seen versions of that have been incredibly biased because the individuals coding it made it biased in the first place. So actually we need that more than anything else to make sure that thing is done in the right way.
And one of those key skills that will be required now are people that are the scrutineers of this technology. Anything that's got significant consequence or downside risk or heavily regulated environments is going to need humans in the loop. And you need those humans to be able to get right into understanding the output of these algorithms. And this is why you need the breadth of all these skills available.
And there you go, guys. Diversity and inclusion, top score of the day. But great conversation. Let's move on to our next segment. A little bit of fun. My favourite part, top of the ops. So this is again a little bit of a poke fun at the industry. So there are so many ops in the industry at the moment. We've all heard of them. So DevOps was the main one, and then it was SecOps and DevSecOps and GitOps and FinOps and whatnot. I heard one the other day which was LLM Ops, if you can get your tongue around that one. And I'm not even going to attempt to understand what that is at the moment and how it works, but I think it's piggybacking off of ML Ops, which is slightly easier to say. But yes, top of the ops. Which one's yours? What's your favourite and why?
Right, so now this feels really boring now that you've said that at the beginning. So it is actually FinOps, because if you don't do that bit right, so you don't structure your cells at a foundational level to be able to consume services. So if you think a lot of organisations have gone from traditional capex-based amortisation over 5-7 years, wind the tin down over time, all of a sudden now they're being faced into more kind of monthly based, like a phone bill type thing, with an itemisation of all the services you're consuming. If your organisation isn't set up to take that in, and a lot aren't, if I'm brutally honest, that's really scary, because that stuff has to be accounted for somewhere, in which case it's on your P&L, and at some point that is going to go out into the market, especially if you're a kind of, FTSE 100 organisation. So staying on top of how your cloud spend and what the appropriate conditions are, whether that's setting up the process, the people, the tech, the tool chain, whatever it might be, to be able to manage both whilst you're in your old style of finance, during and in transition, and then when you've kind of fully gone to the cloud, is a really important enabler. And actually, when it's not there, it can completely grind the whole migration to a halt. And so whether you call it FinOps or whatever, making sure the conditions for success are set up in the right way to stop you from accidentally going, the wrong way and everything being paused until you fix it is one of those things. And as part of that, making sure you've got a tagging and labelling strategy that even enables you to see the cost would be my top tip on that one.
Excellent. Thank you. And Rob?
It's a very, very short one, Dan. As someone from a Scottish and Yorkshire background who grew up in Nottingham, AI ops. There's too many vowels. It's just too many vowels for me to string out every half an hour or so.
So Tim, last episode, he touched on ML ops. So are you able to tell us the difference?
ML ops is, like I say, it's slightly better, yeah. I mean, only in so much that AI doesn't really exist. It's this enormous brand name that captures everything happening at the moment. So clearly machine learning has very particular features when it comes to this part of the work. And then it might get into Gen AI ops, but then you're getting really complicated on the vowels on this as well.
So that's a new one you just coined there. You heard it here first. Brilliant. Well, that brings us to the end of the show and the episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our listeners at home as well for listening. Tune in next month for another exciting episode and show. I want you both, I want to say thank you again for having us here, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and having us on for the first episode where we're in person. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully get to do this again at some point. Going to put you on the spot here. Got a hot take to finish the episode on and leave our listeners with something to think about?
Can we have first, Bonnie?
Yes, right. You can chuck me under the bus. It's fine. Hot take. So I was thinking this through earlier on, because I know you mentioned it, so you might have to edit that bit out, by the way. I think the hot take is be brave, right? Be curious, explore. Don't stop questioning, don't stop asking, don't stop looking. The evolutions that we've seen in the last 20, 25 years are because human race has been curious. I think curiosity is a positive thing. And so actually enabling more individuals to be curious and to evolve us as a species and actually look at solving some of the more, the really significant challenges that we've got to get over, whether that's the environment or sustainability or other conditions. But so the hot take is definitely be brave and be curious.
Wow, I think that's the most profound and best hot take we've had so far on the show. So
I'm just going to very, very quickly build on that. I'll just augment yours further, Bonnie. But
excellent.
I think you can be brave and be curious. You can be sensible with this technology, but just bear in mind that the robots don't want to kill us. So don't be afraid. Just do it in a sensible way. Exactly. Well, they'll never want to kill us. So just be sensible about it. But there's a serious thing about the narrative we use around this tech. So much of it is noise and nonsense. So focus on a calm, sober central path down the middle. Avoid the hype and not try to avoid the dystopia as well that comes into it, and just be sensible about it. I think that's the way forward.
Well, what a lovely positive note to end the show. Thanks again, and thanks again for listening at home. Bye-bye.